It was a moment of silence before the storm, a stretch of endless black where only the cold stars seemed to whisper. Humanity's voice had echoed once into the void, but now it was met only with laughter. The Vexar Dominion didn't care about the weaklings' warning. They had come to crush them, to remind the galaxy that no species, not even humanity, could escape their iron grasp. The Vexar were not just a race. They were a relentless force of nature, a star-born empire bred from the harshest of environments where the strongest survived and the weak vanished into the ether. Their ships, organic in design, pulsed with a life of their own. Glowing, breathing vessels, capable of regenerating wounds and shattering anything in their path. Their weapons, plasma-based and built into their very beings, burned hot enough to melt metal and scorch the flesh of anything unlucky enough to stand against them. They didn't need to understand technology. They were the ultimate evolution, and everything else, in their eyes, was inferior. It was on this day that the Vexar Dominion set its sights on New Eden, a peaceful colony in the Terran Colonial Alliance. It had once been a thriving agricultural world, a jewel of human effort and ambition. Now, it was about to become another tragic footnote in the galaxy's ever-expanding archive of conquest. Humanity had seen war before. Devastating, internal strife that had nearly torn them apart. But the Alliance was still intact, still stubbornly holding on to its colonies, despite the scars of past battles. The Terran Colonial Alliance wasn't perfect, but it was fiercely protective of what it had left. The colonies were more than just settlements. They were humanity's legacy, each one an investment in their future. And if there was one thing the Vexar had miscalculated, it was this. Humans were not simply creatures of survival. They were creatures of resolve. "You will bow to the Dominion," the Vexar's voice boomed across the open frequencies, its contempt dripping from every word. Their emissary, an officer of high rank, had arrived aboard a vast, living dreadnought, a terrifying vessel capable of turning cities to ash with a single command. The transmission was clear: submit now or face annihilation. The response from the Terran Colonial Alliance was swift, cold, and absolute. "This is your final warning, Vexar. Do not step any further into our space. Do not harm our people. You will unleash a fire you cannot comprehend. Stand down." It was not a threat but a plea, though its delivery carried the weight of a promise. The Vexar, biologically incapable of understanding the true nature of humanity's threat, scoffed. In their minds, humans were just a fragile, technologically crippled race incapable of fighting back against their superior biology. "Weaklings," the Vexar commander muttered under his breath as he dismissed the message. To him, the idea of humans wielding anything resembling true power was laughable. They were an annoyance at best. Insignificant insects, buzzing in the vastness of the universe. The humanity's words had been a final plea for peace, one last chance to avoid the coming storm. When it became clear the Vexar would ignore the warning, the Alliance made its own preparations. The defense fleets were scrambled, their ships ready to fight, their leaders knowing full well they would need to make a stand. It was not long before the Vexar made their move. The Vexar fleet descended on New Eden like a wave crashing onto the shore, their ships burning across the sky with a sickeningly graceful power. They attacked not with diplomacy or negotiation, but with fire and fury. The agricultural colony, so vital, so peaceful, was obliterated, its inhabitants given no mercy. The Vexar had no interest in making an example of humanity's defiance. They wanted to break them utterly, to send a message, and the message they sent was a public execution. The colony governor, an older man with a face lined with years of service to his people, was brought to the planet's square, bound, and exposed to the raging, agonizing plasma fire. His screams echoed across the transmission waves, his body burning in a horrific display of suffering. The Vexar commander watched, his face blank as the flames consumed the man's form. "Observe the frailty," he said, turning to his crew with a cold smirk. "This is the fate of all who defy the Dominion. Your fire is but a candle to our star." And then they broadcast it. His death. The screams, the sheer agony of a life snuffed out in the most brutal way possible, across the galaxy for all to see. It was not just a warning to humanity. It was a statement to every species that dared to think themselves safe. The Vexor were here, and they would not be stopped. As the transmission spread across space, humanity's response wasn't one of despair. No. It was a cold, volcanic fury that began to build within every colony. Every human that witnessed the execution, every soul who saw that broadcast, knew one thing. The Vexor had just made their mistake. They had underestimated the power of a race that, though fractured, had always fought for its future. They thought humanity was weak. They thought humans were fragile. But the Vexor had never truly understood what it meant to be human. To survive is one thing, but to fight, to rise from the ashes of a slaughter and never surrender, is another. And now, the galaxy would bear witness to the consequences of their miscalculation. The galaxy had seen humanity's helplessness. The Vexor had flaunted their dominance, mocking the final plea for peace. But what they failed to realize was this. Humans weren't asking for mercy. They were simply giving the Vexor a chance to walk away, alive. And when the Vexor chose to ignore it, they had sealed their fate. The fire would come, and when it did, it would burn far brighter than anything the Vexor could have ever imagined. The flames of New Eden had only just begun to fade in the minds of humanity when something far darker took root. It wasn't the shock of what had been done to the colony governor that drove the Alliance to its knees. It was the callousness of it. The Vexor had not just killed in cold blood. They had reveled in it, broadcasting the agony across the galaxy. And as the screams of the governor reverberated in the airwaves, so too did a collective burning rage among the Terran colonies. The galaxy had heard the Vexor's cruelty, but what they had failed to grasp was this. Humans weren't afraid of death. They were terrified of losing their humanity. The Vexor thought the human response would be submission. They were wrong. A fire was ignited in the hearts of every Terran, one that could not be extinguished by plasma fire or cold-blooded calculations. In the cold, desolate void, humanity found its resolve. The colonies came together as never before, their fractured unity now a singular force, united not by the politics of the Alliance, but by the shared, searing memory of New Eden's fall. The call to arms was clear. The Vexor would pay, not just with blood, but with the very fire they had so eagerly unleashed. In the depths of human space, warships, creaking and scarred from years of internal conflict, rallied at the edge of the system, their crews filled with the same iron determination. The Terran fleets weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting for the very soul of humanity. They had seen the Vexor's power, their devastating weapons, but they had also seen the vulnerability of the enemy. If the Vexor believed humanity was weak, it was now their turn to learn the true meaning of human strength. But the Vexor were not content with their initial victory. After the brutal execution of the governor, they didn't just sit back and watch. No, the Dominion pushed deeper into human space, expanding their conquest with relentless determination. They struck at key resource worlds rich in minerals, energy, and technology, things humanity had spent years cultivating for their future. They weren't just invading, they were stripping away every resource humanity had worked for. The Vexor's bioships, alive and deadly, tore through human defenses with surgical precision. Their ships were not just machines, they were living creatures, adaptable, able to heal themselves faster than any human ship could ever hope to. Plasma weapons built into their very structures cut through Terran alloys like a hot knife through butter. No shields, no weapons, no tactics seemed to matter. With every engagement, humanity lost more. With every battle, the Vexor's power seemed insurmountable. Humanity fought back with desperate courage, refusing to yield even as their fleets were decimated. The tactics, honed over centuries of military conflict, were simply not enough. Terran warships, their hulls cracked and burning, engaged with reckless abandon, but each attempt to resist felt more and more futile. The Vexar ships regenerated, their biological structures adapting to every strike, leaving the human forces grasping at thin air. The humans were fighting an enemy that simply could not be defeated by conventional means, a war that felt like it could never be won. Yet even in the face of disaster, humanity refused to bend. The Terran Colonial Alliance's most brilliant minds, pushed to the brink of despair, refused to give up. They worked day and night, analyzing every piece of Vexar technology, every scrap of data they could gather from the field. Amid the wreckage, in the sterile labs of human research facilities, a breakthrough came. A young scientist, a brilliant mind that had been focused on the battle for human survival, looked over the latest scans of a Vexar bioship. Her eyes widened as she stared at the data on the screen. The Vexar were an enigma, their biology completely different from anything humanity had encountered before. But there, buried in the data, was something extraordinary. A weakness. The Vexar, she realized, thrived in high-heat environments that allowed their biology to function at its peak. Their ships, their weapons, their very physiology were adapted to extreme heat. But the discovery didn't stop there. The Vexar's biological systems relied on a delicate balance of unstable, hydrocarbon-based cooling fluids to regulate their internal temperature. Without these fluids, their ships and armor would become vulnerable. A specific form of catalyzed oxygen, under the right conditions, could trigger a violent chemical reaction that would cause their cooling systems to implode, turning their own biology against them. The scientist's hands shook as she looked over her notes. She wasn't just staring at a theory. She was staring at a weapon they could use against the Vexar. It wasn't a new warship or advanced technology. It was something simpler, something far more devastating. Humanity had always been resourceful, and now they had a way to turn the Vexar's biological superiority into their greatest weakness. The news spread like wildfire through the ranks of the military. At last there was hope. The Vexar, so sure of their dominance, had overlooked a simple truth. Their very biology was their vulnerability. The tables had turned. Humanity, driven by desperation and an unyielding desire for revenge, now had a chance to strike back. But it wasn't just about a weapon anymore. It was about taking control of the battlefield, about proving to the Vexar that humanity was far more than prey. As humanity began to prepare, with the remnants of its fleets gathering on distant, forgotten worlds, the emotional weight of the discovery wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't just about science. It wasn't just about technology. It was about a species that had been pushed to the brink, a species that had been told it was nothing but fragile prey, now finally realizing its true potential. The Vexar had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the resolve of a species capable of adapting faster than any warship ever could. The Vexar had believed they were invincible. Now, humanity had given them a glimpse of the nightmare to come. The revelation that the Vexar could be defeated had ignited something deeper than hope within humanity. It was a cold, seething fire that burned in the hearts of every man, woman, and child who had witnessed the destruction of New Eden. The Vexar had underestimated their foe, and now humanity was preparing to show them just how deep that mistake ran. The discovery of the Vexar's biological vulnerability was nothing short of revolutionary, but discovery alone wouldn't be enough. The Terran Colonial Alliance needed a weapon, one that could leverage this newfound knowledge and bring the Vexar to their knees. It wasn't about creating a new fleet of ships or developing better weapons systems. No, humanity had something more fundamental at its disposal. A legacy born from years of terraforming and colonization, and it was about to be repurposed into the most devastating weapon in the galaxy. Colonies like New Eden, once fertile and bustling with life, had now been reduced to war zones, their survivors living in the shadow of death. Yet from the ashes of destruction came a dark resolve. Scientists and engineers, working in the shadows, began to secretly reconfigure the dormant atmospheric processors on several key colonies. These processors, which had been designed to regulate the atmosphere and create breathable air for human settlers, were now retooled for a more sinister purpose: to supercompress vast quantities of oxygen stored beneath the planet's surfaces in frozen ice moons or deep planetary core. The decision wasn't made lightly. These processors would convert the oxygen into a highly volatile, catalytically treated form, something so potent it could trigger a violent exothermic reaction. It would turn the Vexor's own biology against them. And yet, for all its scientific brilliance, it was a terrible decision. The very colonies that humanity had sworn to protect, the places where families had lived and dreamed, would now be turned into nothing more than bait and bomb casings. The cost of the plan was inestimable, but the alternative, surrendering to the Vexar, was unimaginable. The memory of New Eden's burning sky, the screams of the governor, the searing plasma that had turned human flesh to ash, still hung in the air. It wasn't just the Vexor who had to answer for what they'd done. Humanity was making a decision. They would make them feel that pain. But in doing so, they were choosing to sacrifice those very worlds. The children playing under the twin suns of Pyrrhus, the farmers working their fields on Solera Prime, all of them would now face an uncertain fate, caught in the crossfire of humanity's need for vengeance. There were no illusions about the cost, but there was no turning back. Pyrrhus 3, a planet once known for its serene atmosphere and sprawling meadows, would become the heart of humanity's strike. The Vexar had been tearing through Terran space with ruthless efficiency, advancing deeper into human territory, leaving only destruction in their wake. The Alliance had no illusions about the Vexar's strength. Yet, as they watched the Vexar fleet moving toward Pyrrhus 3, humanity saw an opportunity, an opening they would exploit with surgical precision. The Vexor, as arrogant as they were powerful, misread the situation. They saw the strange energy signatures coming from piracy as massive shifts in atmospheric pressure, unexplainable fluctuations in the planet's core, and they thought it was just another desperate attempt by humanity to terraform the planet for their own benefit. Perhaps they even thought it was a futile final attempt to shield the planet from destruction, but whatever they believed, it didn't matter. They made their move. The Vexor fleet, the same fleet that had wiped out entire colonies, descended on Pyrrhus 3 with terrifying speed. They fired their plasma lances at the surface, focusing on the oxygen processors they thought humanity had reactivated to try and save their world. Their goal was simple: destroy the processor hubs, obliterate the last remnants of humanity's resources, and leave Pyrrhus 3 a charred ruin. It was a tactic they had used before, a blunt, effective method of eradication. But this time, the Vexor's attack didn't yield the expected result. Instead of merely crippling humanity's last desperate hope, their bombardment set off a chain reaction. The explosions ruptured the oxygen chambers beneath the surface, releasing the supercompressed oxygen into the lower atmosphere in a violent cascade. The oxygen, now catalytically treated and highly volatile, was exposed to the same intense heat from the Vexor's plasma bombardment. The reaction was immediate, horrific, and spectacularly destructive. The air itself seemed to burn, igniting with a ferocity that the Vexar had not anticipated. The human weapon wasn't in the ships, wasn't in the guns, and wasn't in the hands of soldiers. It was in the very air, the atmosphere, the chemistry of life itself. The Vexor had unwittingly created the perfect conditions for their own annihilation. The first Vexar ships exploded in a blinding fireball, their bioships consumed by their own biological weaknesses. Soldiers in battle suits who had once believed themselves impervious to harm screamed in terror as their internal cooling systems ignited. The intense pressure and heat tore through their bodies as their advanced armor became nothing more than an oven. The Vexar's superior biology, their greatest strength, had become their most deadly weakness. As the Vexar fleet erupted into chaos, humanity's forces, safe in their specially designed bunkers and ships, watched with grim satisfaction. They did not engage, they merely observed, knowing that the battle was won. The moment humanity had feared, the moment they had prepared for, had arrived, and the Vexar had unknowingly provided the spark that would bring their doom. From the command bunker on Pyrrhus III, Admiral Thorne watched the nightmare unfold. His voice, when he spoke, was as cold as the void itself. He opened a channel to the surviving Vexar ships, his words cutting through the panic of the moment. "You burned our people alive for defiance. You ignored our threat. Now, Vexar Dominion, watch as we burn your forces alive." There was no victory dance, no wild celebration. There was only a bitter, resolute calm in the face of the devastation they had wrought. The stakes had shifted beyond survival now. Humanity had crossed the threshold into a new, horrifying chapter. What they had once feared, becoming the monsters of the galaxy, had come to pass. But it had not been for nothing. The Vexar had underestimated humanity. They had believed the Terrans were too fragile, too weak to fight back. But now they had been shown a terrifying truth. Humanity, when pushed to the brink, was capable of turning even the very air itself into a weapon. And the Vexar would never forget it. The first explosion was subtle, almost quiet, before it tore through the atmosphere like a burst of light from a dying star. Then came the roar, a cataclysmic blast that shattered the stillness of space, sending ripples of heat and shockwaves across Pyrrhus III's surface. It was not just an explosion, but the birth of something far worse. The oxygen processors, once intended to give life to a dying planet, had now been transformed into instruments of death. The Vexar's bombardment, thought to be the final blow to humanity's last defenses, had set off a chain reaction that would be remembered in the annals of history as the moment the Vexar sealed their own fate. The compressed oxygen, held for so long beneath the frozen surface of Pyrrhus III, was released in a violent flood. The explosion, far more powerful than any simple bombardment, was now an uncontainable blaze. The superheated plasma from the Vexar's plasma lances mixed with the released oxygen, causing an exothermic chain reaction, a reaction that burned through the very air itself, igniting everything in its path. The air wasn't just on fire, it was the fire, spreading through every crevice, every vessel, every piece of Vexar technology. Humanity's scientists had always suspected this was possible. They had theorized that the Vexar's biological systems, so reliant on delicate hydrocarbon-based cooling fluids, would be vulnerable to such an attack. What they hadn't realized was the sheer magnitude of the destruction that would follow. It wasn't just the destruction of a planet or a fleet. It was the unraveling of a biological empire built on dominance. The Vexar's bioships, once thought invulnerable, began to disintegrate from within. Their organic forms, twisted, adaptable structures, began to turn against themselves. The internal cooling systems, overloaded and destabilized, combusted with terrifying violence. The bioships writhed and buckled under the strain as the very fluids that kept them alive became their doom. The first ships exploded with a deafening roar, their once dominant forms reduced to twisted metal and charred flesh. Their shields, once impervious, failed under the combined pressure of oxygen and heat, leaving their crews defenseless. Inside the ships, the Vexar soldiers, biologically superior, engineered for battle, were reduced to nothing more than ash in the blink of an eye. The heat was too intense for their advanced battle suits. The Vexar soldiers' circulatory systems ignited, their bodies caught in a fiery hell that melted their armor and consumed them from the inside out. It wasn't just an explosion. It was a funeral pyre. A funeral pyre for an empire that had believed itself invincible. The Vexar fleet, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now burned in space like a constellation of dying stars. Ships tore apart in a hellish spectacle of self-immolation, their hulls breaking apart in violent showers of sparks and fire. Plasma lances that had once been the instruments of devastation were now mere sparks in the inferno that consumed their creators. And yet, Humanity's forces did nothing. They didn't rush into the fray to claim their victory. They didn't fire another shot. They had already done the unthinkable. Their job was not to fight. It was to witness. To watch as the Vexar, so sure of their superiority, were consumed by their own arrogance. They had been shown the power of humanity's wrath, and now they were paying the price for underestimating what humans were capable of. In their specially designed bunkers, human soldiers remained hidden, shielded from the firestorm that raged across the Vexar fleet. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout in victory. There was no celebration, only the grim satisfaction that the Vexar had been destroyed by their own hand, by the very fire they had once unleashed on humanity. They could hear the explosions, feel the tremors as the Vexar ships were torn apart in their final moments, but it wasn't joy that filled the air. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the weight of what had just occurred pressing down on them all. Admiral Thorne, standing in the command bunker on Pyrus 3, stared out at the unfolding destruction, his face impassive. His eyes tracked the spiraling wreckage of Vexar ships, their glowing remnants tumbling toward the planet below. The firestorm stretched out across the sky, consuming everything in its path. As the last of the Vexar ships began to detonate in a final, fiery explosion, Thorne opened a communication channel to the surviving Vexar forces. His voice was cold, devoid of any hint of elation, only the grim finality of what had been done. "You burned our people alive for defiance," he said, his words carrying across the channel. "You ignored our threat. Now, Vexar Dominion, watch as we burn your forces alive." The message echoed through the chaos, cutting through the screams and explosions as the Vexar fleet was consumed. It wasn't a victory. It was justice, cold and unyielding, delivered by the very hands that had once been forced to plead for peace. There was no exultation in Thorne's voice, just the inevitable conclusion of a war that had been won through patience, through a calculated response to an enemy that never understood the price of its arrogance. As the firestorm raged on, the emotional consequence of the battle began to settle in. Humanity had won, but the cost was clear. The victory was not one of triumph. It was a hollow victory, a bitter reminder of the darkness that had been unleashed. The humans had become the monsters they once feared, but they had done so for survival, for vengeance, for the memory of their fallen. And as the last of the Vexar ships were consumed in the flames, humanity looked at the remains of the Dominion's fleet and understood something deeper. This was the price of survival. This was the cost of defying humanity's strength. The galaxy had watched the Vexar burn. Now they would watch as humanity became the force that would never be ignored again. Since then, the Martians had stood. But whoever had before victory had suffered, and the devastation that swept across Pyrus 3 was not just physical. It was a permanent scar that would be felt across the galaxy for generations to come. What had once been a lush, vibrant world, a place of life and growth, was now a desolate wasteland. The atmosphere, once rich with breathable air, had become a poisonous cauldron, tainted by the catalytic residue of the oxygen-based weapon unleashed by humanity. It was no longer a place of habitation, but a barren memorial to the consequences of war. Firestorms raged across the landscape, fueled by the explosive release of compressed oxygen and the remnants of the Vexar fleet that had been consumed by their own biotechnological failure. There was no rebuilding Pyrus 3. It was dead. Its ecosystems forever destroyed, its skies forever stained with the smoke of its obliteration. The aftermath of the battle, a planet reduced to ashes, echoed through the corridors of power in the Terran Colonial Alliance. Humanity had achieved its victory, but at a cost that could never be undone. The once proud Vexar fleet, a formidable force that had been poised to sweep through human space like a storm, was now reduced to wreckage. What had been the epitome of biological superiority was now scattered debris. Self-immolating bioships, mangled technology, and the bodies of soldiers whose arrogance had led them to believe they were untouchable. In the wake of this destruction, the Vexor Dominion began to crumble. Their leadership, once united in its belief in their invulnerability, fractured under the weight of the catastrophic loss. Some factions, terrified by the very chemistry they had sought to manipulate, retreated into isolation, paralyzed by the fear that humanity could now weaponize not just firepower, but the very fabric of life itself. Their fear was justified. Humanity had shown them a weapon that was not bound by shields or conventional tactics, one that turned their biology against them. The Vexor, once the apex predators of the galaxy, had been humbled by their own overconfidence. Other Vexar factions, driven by rage and a thirst for vengeance, launched desperate retaliatory raids into human space. These were not well-calculated attacks. They were frenzied, suicidal attempts to reclaim their honor and restore their damaged pride. Yet, every attack was met with the same horrifying end. The Vexar, blinded by their rage, ignored the lessons their defeat had taught them. Humanity, ever patient, allowed the Vexar to strike, then unleashed the same devastating chemical fury that had broken them before. Every raid, every desperate attempt at retribution, ended in the same fiery spectacle. The Vexar had learned nothing, and they were dying for it. But it wasn't just the Vexar who were changed by the war. The galaxy, too, had been watching, and what it saw altered the balance of power forever. No longer was humanity the underdog, the prey at the mercy of predatory species like the Vexar. The Terran Colonial Alliance, once fractured and struggling to survive, was now a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy could no longer dismiss humans as weak or technologically crippled. Humanity had proven its strength, its ability to endure, to adapt, and to unleash a terrifying vengeance when pushed to the edge. In the wake of the Vexar's destruction, humanity's reputation shifted dramatically. They were no longer viewed with condescension or indifference. Now, they were feared. The horror of victory, however, weighed heavily on those who had fought to secure it. The power that humanity had demonstrated was undeniable, but it came at a soul-searing cost. The Alliance knew it could defeat any enemy now, but the price of that power was etched deep into their collective psyche. Humanity had used methods they had never before imagined, methods that blurred the line between survival and monstrosity. The terror unleashed on Pyrus III, the weaponized chemistry that had turned oxygen into a death sentence for the Vexar, was a force so destructive that no one could ignore its implications. Humanity had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In the dark corridors of the Alliance's leadership, the question that gnawed at everyone's mind was the same. Had they become the very thing they had once feared? Had they sacrificed their soul for victory? The haunting images of burning Vexar soldiers, their bodies consumed by the very fire that had once burned humanity's colonies, lingered in the minds of every soldier, every scientist, every leader. They had fought to protect their people, but what had they become in the process? A people capable of such destruction, of such unimaginable cruelty, was no longer simply a victim. They were the weapon. As the Alliance moved forward, rebuilding its shattered worlds and integrating the surviving colonies into a unified force, the reality of what they had achieved began to sink in. Humanity had taken its first step into a new era, one where they could wield unimaginable power, but at what cost? There was no celebration, no victory parade, just a quiet, heavy realization that they had done what no one had ever thought possible. They had not just defeated an empire, they had shattered the very notion of what it meant to be conquerors. In doing so, they had become something far more dangerous, a species capable of creating firestorms from the very air they breathed. The emotional toll of that victory would never fade. Humanity had won, the Vexar had been repelled, but the galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. The cost of victory, the moral consequences of using a weapon that could destroy entire species with the mere flick of a switch, had left a scar on the hearts of those who had fought for it. The question that remained was not just how humanity would survive, but how it would live with what it had become. The retreat of the Vexor Dominion rippled across the galaxy with the force of a supernova. Their once invincible fleet, reduced to cinders and shattered remnants, left behind a void, one that echoed with the silence of their withdrawal, the quiet that was filled only by the smoke of their ruin. The galaxy, which had long viewed humanity as a fragile species, was now forced to reconsider its position. What had been dismissed as human weakness, a race barely clinging to survival, was now a formidable force, one capable of wielding power that even the greatest empires feared. Other species who had once seen humanity as little more than a nuisance began to reassess. The Vexar's defeat was a slap in the face to all who had assumed their dominance was unchallenged. The ripples spread like shock waves, and suddenly humanity was not just another species in the galaxy. It was a threat, an enigma wrapped in vulnerability, with the capacity to strike with terrifying force. Respect, however reluctant, replaced skepticism. Fear replaced indifference. From the core worlds of the Confederation of Xanthar to the remote moons of the Rigel Syndicate, ambassadors, military leaders, and strategists began to quietly observe, study, and reconsider. Some saw humanity as an emerging power, one that had played a long game, patient, calculating, and now showing its hand. Others saw them as a dark harbinger, a species that had been pushed too far, too deep into the abyss of war, and would never again be the same. But even as the galaxy's gaze shifted, the internal conflict within humanity's own ranks began to fester. The victory over the Vexar, while undeniable, was a double-edged sword. The Terran Colonial Alliance had secured its borders, driven the Vexar from human space, but at what cost? The methods humanity had employed were not just brutal, they were borderline monstrous. The use of chemical weapons, the transformation of entire worlds into traps, the sacrifices made on the altar of vengeance. These were tactics that no one had expected, from a race once considered noble. Within the Alliance, factions began to splinter. Some argued that the victory had justified the means, that humanity had done what it had to in order to survive. These factions saw no other choice but to continue leveraging humanity's newfound strength. They weren't just protectors anymore, they were conquerors, the keepers of an empire that had been forged in the fire of war. For them, the power humanity now held was a tool to shape the galaxy in its image, a galaxy that would bow before the might of the Terran Colonial Alliance. But others, their minds heavy with the moral weight of the victory, began to question, was this what humanity had become? Was the price of survival worth it? Were they any better than the Vexar, using weapons that obliterated entire species? The echoes of Pyrus III's destruction, the memory of burning worlds and the innocent lives caught in the crossfire, weighed heavily on the conscience of the Alliance. There were voices within the military and the political spheres calling for restraint, for a return to the ideals that had once guided humanity's efforts, ideals of peace, diplomacy, and mutual cooperation. But these voices were drowned out by the cries of those who saw power as the only language the galaxy understood. And so, humanity found itself at a crossroads. They had the strength to protect themselves, to defend their borders from any threat, but they also had the power to expand, perhaps even dominate. The question was not whether humanity could conquer the galaxy, but whether it should. The same question echoed in every chamber of government, in every military command center, in the quiet reflections of every human soldier who had fought on Pyrus III. Would they become the protectors they once were, guarding the innocent from the horrors they had faced? Or would they embrace the role of aggressors, using their new strength to impose their will upon the galaxy? In the aftermath of victory, humanity was not just dealing with the shattered remnants of the Vexar. They were facing something far more dangerous: themselves. As the debate raged within the Alliance, the galaxy outside waited, watching. The eyes of every other species were upon humanity, judging. They had seen humanity's destructive power, but would they now see it as a force of preservation or oppression? No one could say for certain. the future of humanity, and the galaxy itself, hung in the balance. In the meantime, humanity moved forward, not with blind arrogance, but with a self-aware understanding of what they had become. They had walked to the very edge of destruction and had looked over it, had stared into the abyss and seen themselves reflected in it. Now they were left with a choice: to return to the light of their original ideals, or to embrace the shadows they had touched in their pursuit of survival. The Alliance knew one thing: their position had changed forever. The Vexar were gone. Their enemies had been repelled. But in their place stood a new threat, a threat from within, a species capable of unimaginable destruction, a species that had learned the true meaning of power, but now had to come to terms with its own capacity for horror. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again, and neither would humanity. The retreat of the Vexar Dominion was not a strategic withdrawal, it was a broken exodus. Once an empire that had roared across the stars, their power now lay in tatters. The Vexar had been shattered, their once unified command now fractured into warring factions, each one struggling to understand the magnitude of their defeat. The arrogance that had defined them, that had led them to believe they were invincible, now seemed like the empty posturing of a dying species. Leaders who had once stood proud, their chests swollen with the confidence of their biological superiority, now cowered in the face of the destruction humanity had unleashed upon them. They had underestimated their enemy in the worst way possible, and now they were paying for it, haunted by the fiery hellscape humanity had created for them. There were no celebrations among the Vekkar, no proud declarations of their supposed superiority. Instead, there was fear, a gnawing, bitter fear that permeated every corner of their shattered empire. As the Vexar retreated, fleeing from human space and licking their wounds, the message humanity had delivered continued to echo in their minds. The sheer terror of the chemical firestorms, the unrelenting power of the human weapon, weighed heavily on them. They knew now that humanity was not to be trifled with. The warning, once brushed aside as empty rhetoric, had been delivered with horrifying finality. Every retreat the Vexar made, every failed attack on human colonies was a reminder, a constant, burning reminder, that humanity had the power to annihilate them. But not all factions of the Vexar were ready to concede defeat. Some leaders, their pride wounded beyond repair, were intent on vengeance. They would not go quietly into the night. There was no honor in surrender, no solace in survival without retribution. These Vexar remnants launched a final series of desperate, suicidal attacks on human colonies, throwing themselves at the human defenses with the madness of cornered animals. But once again, they met the same horrifying fate. Humanity had prepared. Humanity had learned. With every retaliatory strike, the Vexar brought about their own destruction. Their bioships, vulnerable to the very chemistry humanity had used to defeat them, once again became their undoing. Each attack, each vengeful assault, ended in catastrophic self-destruction. It was as if the Vexar had unwittingly signed their own death sentence, time and time again. Humanity, now in control of the situation, watched from the safety of their newly fortified colonies. They did not engage in these final skirmishes. They did not chase down the Vexar remnants. They had already delivered their message. No further action was necessary. The Vexar were broken. The Vexar were done. But this victory did not come without its own complications. Humanity, though victorious, began to explore the deeper ramifications of their newfound power. The war had cost them more than they had bargained for. Yes, they had defeated the Vexar. Yes, they had emerged as the dominant force in the galaxy. But the price of that victory had been steep. The use of chemical weapons, the devastation of entire planets, the total eradication of an enemy, these were things that would leave scars, and those scars would be carried by humanity for generations to come. The diplomatic fallout was inevitable. Leaders, once united in their purpose to survive, now found themselves at odds. Humanity's victory had shifted the balance of power, but it had also made the rest of the galaxy wary. The question now was not whether humanity could defend itself, it was whether humanity would ever be trusted again. What would the galaxy think of a species capable of such devastation? Would they be welcomed as protectors or feared as a new imperial power? Humanity, fully aware of the implications of their actions, began to tread carefully. They did not want another war. They did not want to become the very thing they had fought against. They wanted peace, but peace in the shadow of a victory that was as monstrous as it was necessary. They had the power to reshape the galaxy, to bend it to their will. But did they want to? Could they? In the quiet moments of reflection, as the fires of war finally died down and the scars of battle began to heal, the emotional cost of victory became clear. Humanity had won, but they had crossed a line. They had become a species capable of unimaginable destruction, capable of using chemistry and biology as weapons of mass devastation, and though they had defeated their enemies, they could never undo the choices they had made. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. No longer were they the underdog, struggling to survive. No longer were they the prey. They had become a predator in their own right, capable of reshaping the future with the power they had demonstrated. And though they were not the Vexar, their victory carried the same weight. Humanity had taken their place in the galaxy's power structure, but they had also inherited the moral ambiguity of their actions. They had shown the galaxy that, when pushed to the brink, humanity could be both a protector and a destroyer. The retreat of the Vexar was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new era. Humanity had emerged from the shadows of history and had claimed its place in the stars. But with that emergence came the sobering realization that the cost of victory had been steep and the future was uncertain. What would humanity become now that it had the power to shape the galaxy? The scars of war, like the scars of Pyrrhus III, would never truly fade. They would serve as a reminder that victory came at a price. And that price had been paid in full. Pyrrhus III was no more. The planet that had once been a thriving testament to humanity's reach had become a monument to its devastating potential. It was now called the Torch, a name that burned in the hearts of all who remembered the price of victory. From a distance, it might have appeared as just another desolate, forgotten world, but for those who had witnessed its transformation, who had watched the sky turn to fire, the soil scorch under the weight of unimaginable force. It was more. It was a symbol. The torch was a chilling reminder of the power humanity now wielded. It was the fire that could burn everything to the ground, the tempest of chemical destruction that had eradicated a species. It was a monument to a victory earned, but also to the dark choices humanity had made in its quest for survival. The very air of Pyrrhus III was tainted by the scars of what humanity had done. Its once vibrant atmosphere, now laced with toxic residue, was a lasting testament to what was achieved, and at what cost. In the years following the war, the galaxy's view of humanity was irrevocably altered. No longer the underdogs, the Terran colonial alliance had ascended to a position of power, a force that could no longer be ignored. The other species of the galaxy, once skeptical and dismissive, now looked upon humanity with a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. The Vexar, once the undisputed rulers of the stars, had been broken, but they were far from gone. They had retreated, scattered into factions, and though they were no longer a direct threat, the echoes of their existence lingered in the shadows. They had learned their lesson, the hard way, but the question remained: would they rebuild? And if so, would they seek vengeance? Humanity, on the other hand, now faced an even more difficult reality. They had secured their borders, yes, and the galaxy knew now that they could destroy any enemy with terrifying ease. But the power they had demonstrated came with a price, the moral cost of using such a weapon. The knowledge of what they were capable of would haunt them forever. Could they ever return to being the protectors they once were? Could they ever walk the line between the guardians of peace and the executioners of annihilation? The question weighed heavily on every leader, every soldier, every citizen of the Terran Colonial Alliance. The galaxy, once a place where humanity was a fledgling species fighting for survival, now saw them as something else, a power in its own right, a force that could both protect and destroy. But there was no true peace. Victory had come at a terrible cost. Humanity had defeated the Vexar, but they had also crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The scars of war were not just physical, not just in the ruined planets or the remnants of the Vexar fleet. They were psychological, emotional. Humanity knew that it could never be the same after wielding such power. There was no peace to celebrate, no triumph to exult, only the cold realization that they had become something else. Humanity's new position in the galaxy was undeniable. They were now the power to be reckoned with, the species that had shown the universe what true devastation looked like. And yet, as they surveyed the galaxy from their new place in the stars, the question lingered. What would they do with this power? Would they seek to protect the innocent, as they once had? Or would they become the very thing they had fought against, an imperial force that imposed its will on others through fear and might? As the political and military leaders of the Alliance gathered to discuss the future, the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. They had the power to shape the galaxy, to bend it to their will, but at what cost? Were they prepared to live with the consequences of their actions? Could they find a way to protect without destroying, to ensure that their newfound power did not corrupt them in the end? In the quiet moments of reflection, Admiral Thorne, who had seen the worst of what humanity could do, stood alone in the command center, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The memory of Pyrus III, of the firestorms and the ash, lingered in his mind. He had been part of the machine that had delivered the final blow to the Vexar. He had seen the devastation firsthand, watched as the Vexar's arrogance was burned away in an inferno of their own making, and yet, as he stood there, the hollow echo of victory rang louder than any sense of triumph. Humanity had won. The Vexar were no more, but the true cost of that victory was a price that would never be paid in full. The scar of Pyrus III would remain, not just on the planet, but on the soul of every person who had fought in that war. Peace, Thorne muttered to himself, is a fragile thing, and we who once fought for it are now the keepers of its flame. But who will light the way when the fire turns on us? It was a dark thought, but one that every leader of the Alliance now faced. What did it mean to be the protectors of the galaxy when the very fire that protected could just as easily destroy? And could humanity ever truly return to its ideals of peace when it now held the power to burn everything to the ground? The galaxy had witnessed humanity's rise from the ashes of war, but as the final flames of the Vexar were extinguished, humanity's future remained uncertain. The torch had been passed, not to peace, but to something more dangerous, the knowledge of their own power. And now, they had to decide what kind of future they would forge. As humanity stands on the precipice of a new era, where will their newfound power lead them? Will they remain protectors, or will they become the very thing they once fought against? The choice is theirs, and yours. What do you think? Can humanity ever truly return to its ideals of peace, or is this the price of survival? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking sci-fi stories that challenge the boundaries of power, morality, and survival.